So hi, everybody, and welcome to the Soft Matter seminar series hosted by the Center for Soft Matter Research at New York University. I'm really glad you all came out, and I'm very happy today to introduce our speaker, Chris Santangelo from the Department of Physics at Syracuse University. So Chris is a is a major figure in soft matter theory. He got his PhD from Santa Barbara, where I guess you worked with the inimitable Phil Pincus, isn't that right?
Yes, that is absolutely correct.
Yeah, inimitable. I can almost say that word if I try hard. And so after that, he went to a postdoc at Penn with Randy Kamian, and then he transferred his flag to be an assistant professor at UMass Amherst. He rose through the ranks, so he got a career award from the NSF there. I guess he was one of the last recipients of the GSoft Young Investigator Award from the APS, because after that it was DSoft. So the end of a tradition. And so most recently he transferred his flag to Syracuse, where he's a key member of their really vibrant soft matter community there. So Chris is sort of like, he styles his work as materials geometry, which is kind of like a sort of provocative title. And it's because, as Chris tells us, geometry directs the pathways that systems can take as they organize themselves. And therefore it helps to determine what kind of states of organization are possible. So geometry and topology. And this theme has just hit again and again and again throughout his studies, his early studies in liquid crystals and hindered diffusion of proteins on the surface of cell membranes, right up to his most recent work on origami and self-folding materials and their applications to mechanical metamaterials. So if you want to know more about the field, Chris has a really nice perspective article in Soft Matter that just like it's bite-sized, and it gives just a really nice overview. I'll put that in the chat so that, assuming that I can find the chat. So I'll put that in the chat so that you can all go get it if you want. And there it is. There you go. And I think Chris is going to be building on those themes today. So rather than taking up your time, I'm going to let Chris illuminate you.
Oh, thank you. It almost sounds like you're talking about somebody else. I barely recognize that guy you're introducing. All right, so now I have to share my screen. So give me a second to do it. All right, so you should be looking at slides now. Is it still working? All right, great. So I am, so as David said, I'm Chris Santangelo. I have recently moved to Syracuse University, part of the physics department and part of the new bio-inspired institute there, where we take the word bio-inspired to mean almost anything. And what I'm going to tell you about, though I can't see my title underneath the Zoom thing anymore, is basically about how to create three-dimensional shapes from flat structures. And we're going to push that forward, and I'm going to tell you about a lot of new stuff, not any of which has been actually published yet, and yet I'm still going to allow recordings, so we'll see how that goes. Before getting into the nitty-gritty, I've broken this talk up into three parts, sort of a longer part that I've been calling folding most fowl. You'll see why in a second. And a part on rigidity in cellular looking networks, actually in fiber networks mostly. And then at the end, if there's time, and there may not be, the way that things sometimes go, I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about some really new stuff on creating mechanical logic using a lot of the same principles that we learned about by thinking about the origami. Some of this work is very new in the sense that it actually involves people at Syracuse. In some of it is work that has been kind of ongoing since I was at UMass. Mainly, I'm going to tell you about the work of two students at UMass, Mary Elizabeth and Michelle, and the work of two postdocs that are here at Syracuse that are actually working with Lisa Manning, but you know, have somehow I've managed to get them interested in some of these problems. So that's the basic idea, and I want to put everything in a certain context because and I'm not really going to tell you how to build programmable matter, but I think programmable matter is kind of the context that that I want to have everything kind of sit in. Programmable matter is basically well, it's like the T-1000 from the Terminator 2 movie, if anyone's seen that. That those references are getting old now, but basically the idea is to create materials that can change their properties from you know, when acted on by some external stimulus, and possibly even do so autonomously, and you know, basically think a little bit. So, and that's how I think about it too. Um, there's a couple different pathways to thinking about what programmable matter would be. One is the self-assembly pathway. So there's a lot of people working on creating little robots that, you know, will basically hug each other to create new materials. It's kind of similar. This is actually very bio-inspired because some of you may know that certain ant species will actually use themselves to build structural elements like bridges that span between leaves and allow other ants to walk on top of them, or otherwise build rafts that float in the water. And you can study these collections of ants as if they're really materials. And that's kind of the idea behind smart assembly, is to try to take that kind of functionality and turn it into an actual, you know, product, an actual thing that you can hold in your hand that doesn't necessarily want to bite you. The other avenue, and that's the avenue that most of my work follows, is to think about folding structures. Okay, so start with something that's initially flat, you do a little fabrication magic to it, you dump it in water, or you spit on it, or, you know, whatever it is that you do, you shake it, and it will fold itself up into the three-dimensional structure that you're necessarily after, and possibly even refold itself depending on what kinds of mechanical properties you're really looking for. So this is really a technology that enables the idea of programmable matter. It's not on its own sufficient to create true programmable matter, but it's the direction that I'm going to kind of come from in getting to a place where we understand the structural parts of these materials well enough to be able to design reconfigurable things. Okay, so that's context. And there's a particular reason that we're really interested in these kind of folded structures. One is that really there's a very large number of things you can make from what starts out life as just a flat sheet. And, you know, I think in a lot of talks on this origami stuff, we would just spend like 20 minutes looking at these beautiful images. But here I'll just have the one image of this insect that was folded by Satoshi Kamiya. But in addition to being able to create any three-dimensional structure you want, the same sheet folded up in different ways gives you different kinds of mechanical properties. Okay, and so far the dominant mechanical property that people have actually looked at is I don't know, is auxetism a word? They've basically been trying to design auxetic materials. So this is actually a piece of art, but it's also a flat two-dimensional sheet that expands biaxially rather than expanding uniaxially and contracting in the perpendicular direction like a typical material. This kind of functionality, it turns out, is really easy to come by in origami and in lots of other kinds of structures. But we've also done a little bit of work on reconfigurable origami things, which is what the picture on the left is from. And many people have worked now on trying to figure out how to design folded elements that have certain properties. Okay. So origami, as I said, is essentially useful because it's a set of instructions that you can start with something flat to make something 3D. Okay, so this is an example of the instructions that it would take to make a folded bird, but you can obviously make many different kinds of structures from the same flat sheet. In fact, it turns out that the same fold pattern can, when folded in different ways, create different shapes, which is why I like to show these movies from MIT, the MIT group, where the same kind of generic fold pattern can make a boat and a plane. And it does so, there's basically, this works. This is, well, I'll tell you more about how these self-folding things work in a second anyway. But the idea here is that these origami structures are actually pluripotent. There's many different ways of folding the same fold pattern. And so even one fold pattern will give you many different shapes. Okay, so how does self-folding work? I'm going to focus on one particular mechanism because I'm a little biased towards my collaborators because they collaborate with me, right? So in this case, this is, I'm showing off the work of Ryan Hayward and his former postdoc, now professor Junhee. And in this case, they create these polymer sandwich structures. These are some kind of soft hydrogel interior that's like the peanut butter in this sandwich. And the top and bottom layers are some kind of stiff, very thin polymer. And using some fancy photolithography, they can actually cut trenches in either the top or the bottom layer. You take this thing, you dunk it in water. The middle peanut butter layer, it's usually something like polynipam, except now they're much fancier and they use more sophisticated hydrogels that swell much faster. But the inside layer will swell, and that swelling drives folding. And you can create any folding you want. If you put a trench in the top layer, you get a mountain fold. If you create a trench in the bottom layer, you get a valley fold. And if you create a combination of these trenches, both on the tops and the bottoms, you can create essentially what seems like anything you want. So this on the left is a movie of the structure that is on the right, which I think I've shown many times before. To some of you have seen this like a million times now. This is a ramblet flapping bird seen in a confocal microscope. This thing is tiny, 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 okay? Less than a millimeter across, but nevertheless, it folds very well. And it's probably not the world's smallest origami bird anymore, but it used to be, right? So that was a proud record we used to have as part of this collaboration. Okay, and all of the self-folding things that you see, maybe not all of them, it's not fair to say all of them, but many of them work by a similar principle. There's some kind of differential growth that is applied, and that drives folding into 3 dimensions. There's also things like capillary origami, where or even structures that you create by putting dabs of solder, like in the David Gracias's group, where the surface tension will actually pull sheets together. But so there's lots of different materials that do this. It's a very generic thing, and it's just a matter, you find yourself a experimentalist, and they'll cook up some way of folding a flat sheet, right? And so it's actually been a lot of fun to do this kind of thing. Okay, I want to drill down a little bit more deeply on this bird. Okay, this is the fold pattern of the bird. The red folds, I think, are mountain folds. The blue folds are valley folds. Oh yeah, actually, it says so in the legend, so I guess I must be right. And you know how people are when they do experiments, and they always come to you with like these beautiful images, right? It's like, oh look, it works. It looks beautiful, right? We got a nice 3D. We write a paper, right? And at some point it occurred to Ryan and I to ask the postdoc, yeah, well, how many of these things actually fold? I don't know why it didn't occur to us before, probably because we didn't want to hear the bad news before we published a paper on it. And luckily the news is good. Turns out about 50% of these birds fold correctly, but 50% of them fail. And obviously when they fold correctly the same way every time, as far as we can tell with our eyeballs. But when they fail in any number of countless ways. And I will, at some point we'll talk a little bit about how you might count how many different ways there are folding this bird, but it turns out the answer is about 2048. But let's just say it numbers in the thousands, the number of ways that you can try to fold this thing. And we're looking for one particular pathway in this giant space of folds. It's actually pretty amazing that it works 50% of the time, but it does suggest a question, which is, well, when it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? And how can we make it work better, right? What's going on here that causes it to fold sometimes and misfold other times? And why is it that it even works this often? It's clearly not choosing among all the branches with some uniform probability. It's picking one in particular that luckily is the right one for us. But things could have been worse, but maybe we can do better and get it to fold robustly every time. So that's what this first vignette of this talk is actually about. We want to understand better why and when do origami structures actually misfold, and is there any way to improve their yield? Okay, so this is the work actually of Mary Elizabeth, who is a graduate student, technically still at UMass. She will probably remain at UMass until she graduates, but she's excellent. And we are also working with Ryan some more and new postdoc. And I'll show you a little bit about the experiments at the end, but this is all work in progress. So I'm especially interested in people's thoughts on this because we're still we're still working with the details and trying to firm up the results now. All right, so how do we model origami, right? So this is a piece of origami, and I'll tell you right now, I'm only gonna talk about triangulated origami, that is origami made out of triangular faces. And I'll tell you how to generalize that later. But once you have stuff that's made out of triangular faces, the easy thing to do is just to replace all of the edges with springs that have a particular equilibrium length. Because the length constraint on the springs also translates to an angle constraint on the vertices. Okay, so all you have to do is keep track of the length constraints in order to keep to preserve the geometry of these structures and understand the folding process. So that's what this says. In essence, what you might do to think about the kinds of ways of folding a structure is to create a giant vector that just keeps track of all the lengths of all the edges. You stack them all one on top of the other. And the key is to analyze when is this thing equal to 0 and when isn't it, okay? Right off the bat, we can do some really simple counting. We can, for example, count the dimension of the configuration space. What you do, you just take the number of vertices times, I didn't put in the number of dimensions here, but there should be a number of dimensions multiplying this V here. You subtract the number of edges because those act as constraints. Then you get rid of 6 of the degrees of freedom that you would have because those are just translations and rotations and we don't care about those. And what you end up with for a generic piece of triangulated origami after a little bit of extra work is that the number of degrees of freedom scales with the number of vertices on the boundary. Okay, it's actually the number of vertices on the boundary minus 3. So this thing, which has 4 vertices on the boundary, would have exactly 1 degree of freedom. Okay, and this counting works almost everywhere. This is morally equivalent to Maxwell counting in lattices of springs in general, but that's because this is basically just a lattice of springs after all. It's not a lattice, but it's a structure of springs. Okay. But let's drill down a little deeper because there's something funny that happens in these origami structures because, at the outset, it would seem, well, it must be easy. This thing has 1 degree of freedom, right? All I need to do to have a 1 degree of freedom structure is to have 4 vertices on the boundary. How bad can that be? When we look at this set of constraints
Actually,
here.
Chris,
Yeah.
just a sec, sorry. Rolling it back just a second. Mark Gersha is asking, how do you know that there are 4 boundary vertices? Lead us back into the counting.
How do I know that there are 4 boundary vertices? Yeah. So
maybe a better question is, what's a boundary vertex?
Yeah, okay, so that's fair enough. So I should be a little bit more explicit to make sure that don't confuse what I mean by vertices isn't an origami vertex that's surrounded by paper on all 4 sides. It is any the way I'd put it is any vertex. I guess I could call this boundary edges. Maybe that would be a little better. It's easy to identify what a boundary edge is. It's an edge that only shares 1 face, right? And
I think he may be confused because your object looks so 3-dimensional. It's really a piece of paper with lines on it. It's a flat sheet of paper with lines on it.
Yeah.
And you're going to fold it, but you haven't folded it yet. And so they're obviously for vertices on the edge, as long as you recognize that it's not a three-dimensional object and those are continuing on the other side.
Is that right? I don't know if that answers the question or not, though it is true. Basically, once you think about this as a system of vertices and springs and faces, because you want to keep track of the faces as well, you can identify which edges live on the boundary. Those are the ones that only share one face with instead of two faces. And I think you can see my pointer, I believe, right? And then the vertices of those edges are what I would call a boundary vertex.
This was exactly my confusion. So I thought this was a three-dimensional object. That was
Me too.
Yes, not yet. Not yet.
Chris, but speaking about this, the question is whether you have holes in your piece of paper.
I am assuming that you do not have holes in the piece of paper. It does not. You can certainly incorporate holes in the paper. If the holes are triangular, it doesn't matter, obviously. We have thought about what would happen if, for example, you had a quadrilateral. Yes, so, you know, if this thing was actually open, if this edge wasn't here, it does change things a little bit. And I'm just not going to talk about it so that just to avoid adding too much confusion. But
just to make sure what you are talking about. So no hole. Good.
No holes, triangular faces.
Good, thank you.
And the edges stay constant length. Okay.
Oh, and Chris, there's just one other question, which is the folding process reversible or irreversible? So in other words, once the bird folds, can it unfold?
Oh, in the experiments that Ryan does, it is reversible. So you could take it out of the water and it'll flatten up again, and you dunk it back in and it refolds. So that said, there is a little bit of plastic deformation in the sense that once it folds one way, it will tend to refold correctly every time. So that 50% rule is only for the first fold, the first folding of the structure. So something irreversible does happen, and we are pretending that it's okay. We're pretending that that doesn't happen for the purposes of the theory that I'm going to tell you about. Okay. Okay. So what we do in order to think about, or what you could do, is you could look, for example, at the small deformations of these structures. You could, for example, take all the positions of all the vertices and label them with their location. And we can look at how this constraint function changes when you change the positions of the vertices by some very small amount. Okay. And this is where you end up recapturing sort of what I would call standard, the standard theory of these spring networks. You can, if you go to only linear order and the displacements, there is a rigidity matrix. There's a Jacobian basically that's associated with this function f, this set of functions that give you the length of the edges. There's a set of special deformations that we could call zero modes, like everybody else. These are the deformations that live in the kernel of the Jacobian, of the rigidity matrix, which is essentially, these are the things that don't change the lengths of any of the edges to first order. And there are also self-stresses, which live in the kernel of the transpose of the Jacobian, which give you information about the relationships between some of the edges. Okay. And so, for example, we can talk about I thought it would be useful to talk a little bit more about self-stresses, since they're going to play a little bit of a role in the story. If you think of this as a two-dimensional, this is now not a piece of origami that I've drawn here. This is just a two-dimensional network of springs. We can actually count the number of zero modes. We can count the number of the number of vertices. We can count the number of constraints. And we can determine basically that this is a structure that is essentially rigid. Its only zero modes are associated with the two translations in 2D and the one rotation about the z-axis. If we add an extra, where is it here? My builds are being wacky here. Oh, there, I did it. I added the extra edge. If we add an extra edge, now the system is over constrained, and it would seem to have a constraint it doesn't need, but clearly it's just as rigid as it was before. So what's actually happening is that it has developed a self-stress, that some of the constraints are no longer linearly independent of each other, and that self-stress actually manifests as the fact that you could, in fact, apply an extensional stress to some of the beams and a compressional stress on other beams, and all of the vertices will be will have zero net force on them. So the whole thing will be balanced, even though these edges will be under tensions that are either positive or negative. And so self-stresses are really just associated with the fact that these things aren't really linearly independent constraints anymore. Okay. So that's the really fast version of all this, and because I want to keep on talking about how this plays a role in origami, what I'm going to do now is show you the results of the configuration space for one of these structures. So this is a degree 4 vertex, which means that it has one vertex in the center, one origami vertex, and 4 folds coming out of it, and those folds meet 4 vertices on the boundary. So according to our counting rules, this is supposed to have 1 degree of freedom. And when we draw the configuration space, so immediately we have a problem, because what are we going to draw? So I'm drawing here the the supplement of the dihedral angles of the orange, red, and black folds on these axes. Is that the supplement? Supplement's 90 minus, 180 minus, or 90 minus? I can never remember. My daughter's doing this in geometry now, and I still can't remember. Anyway, 180 minus the dihedral angle of these folds. And if we plot that, you can see that the configuration space, the space of things you're allowed to do, really is one-dimensional. It's a curve, right? Except that it's a curve, but there's this funny thing that happens here, right there, where it looks like 2 distinct curves meet at a point. And at that point, okay, you have a self-stress. If you were to do this Maxwell counting, if we were going to do this counting and try to say, okay, well, how many zero modes do I actually have at that point? The answer is actually that you would have 5, okay, which is far too many, because it's still only a one-dimensional system. And the key here is that when you're at a point like this, we actually have to go beyond first order to study the constraints in order to understand exactly how these work. I don't necessarily want to go into all of nobody wants to see me do math, right? I presume. So what I will do is say that if you look at these constraint functions and you expand them to second order in the displacements, and you take the self-stresses that occur at these points where you have these funny singularities, those self-stresses can be used to generate a set of constraints that the first order deformations have to satisfy. So for any one of these systems, there are these special points, which, at least in the case of origami, look like these branch points, where you have to not only look at the zero modes to understand how floppy it is, but you also have to look at a series of quadratic constraints that you have to solve simultaneously. So this is all outlined, this is all done out in this PRX that I wrote, several years ago. The way it manifests in the origami is simply that there is a branch point. And that branch point happens exactly when all the fold angles are 0, exactly when the origami happens to be flat. And from that point, you actually could go off in several different branches, and those represent the different ways of folding one structure, okay? The other thing that we have worked out, it took a while. We were able, but we worked out a formula for the number of branches that you can expect in a typical piece of origami when it's flat. It turns out, with some small corrections, to be exponential in the number of internal vertices. So in this case, an internal vertex is any vertex that's surrounded by only faces. And so this one has 1 internal vertex. So it only has 2 branches, which you can see here. But as the number of internal vertices goes up, the number of branches goes up. We don't know why, okay? All I can tell you is that we've tested this on, tens of thousands now of examples of randomly generated origami. And the formula here always works up to at least 9 internal vertices, but after 9, it starts to take too long to actually bother computing, because it turns out solving quadratic equations is NP hard. But it's not just that, it's actually also hard, right? And takes a long time. So that's as far as we've tested this result, and we don't have any proof of it, but in any case, this is where we get the counting for the number of different ways of folding this randlet bird. Comes from just evaluating this result.
So Chris, you have a grad student question here.
Oh yeah, great.
So the question is, can you actually fold a piece of paper along 4 lines like that? I mean, is this fold something you can do?
Yes. Yes, it is. Okay. One of the folds has to be a valley fold, and the other 3 will have to be a mountain folds. But not only can you do it in 2 different ways, right? Which is the point. Yeah. And if you're wondering, how can this really ever? I don't know how this can possibly really be true, other than it seems to be true. In every example that we know of, it's true. No matter how complicated you make it, it's true as long as the faces are triangles. It is not true if the faces are not triangles. Once the faces are not triangles, you have extra constraints you have to satisfy, and the counting is completely, up in the air. Okay, and that's a very interesting story also, but it's not the story that I necessarily want to focus on. I do want to show you what happens when you have 2 dimensions, just to show you that counting the number of branches still works. It's not because it's 1-dimensional and life is easier and for 1-dimensional curves. This is an example of a 2-dimensional configuration space with 1 internal vertex, which has 2 branches. And here I'm plotting the fold angles of, 3 of these 5 folds. And this is what it looks like. It looks like this really cool looking surface that has this now singular structure. Instead of having 2 places where the lines cross, now you have a cone, a conical structure that appears at the flat state. And if you had more internal vertices, though it becomes harder and harder to plot, you can see, or you can convince yourself, at least numerically, that the more vertices you have inside, the more of these, conical things you have, coming out of the flat state. So it's actually really cool, but it gets really hard to start drawing these surfaces. Getting some geometrical intuition is tough just because it's, you're making these plots in very high dimensions, and then you're trying to look at them in 2 dimensions. It's rough. It's rough stuff. But it does work. Okay. What I do want to tell you about though is real origami doesn't do this, right? Real origami isn't perfect. It actually has some finite elasticity to it. And so what we have been actually doing to try to understand how these things fold is looking at the finite elasticity of these structures. And the easiest way to do that is just to augment all of these constraints with a rigidity. And in addition, because these things are self-folding structures, we're going to augment the constraint matrix with a set of terms that put torsional springs on all of the folds. Okay. In fact, that's essentially how these self-folding things work. You have a torsional spring on all the folds that's driven by the swelling of the material. It's not just free and floppy like, some kind of gangly piece of paper or something. And so we want to include this in our thinking. And once you have it written in this form, you have a vector function, you just square it, and then you get an energy, which is Hookean in all of the length strains, and it's Hookean in the torsional strains. And we can quibble a lot about whether this is a good model for any particular experiment. But what we're going to be after are all the features of this that are independent of the details, we hope, of exactly what the spring constants are, and is it really a torsional spring, or is it really some other kind of nonlinear thing? I think those are interesting questions, but they're clearly going to depend on the experiment that you're doing. Right? So we want to not, hopefully our answers won't depend on those details. Okay, so this is what we do. We can actually write out the energy, and those constraints, after doing a little bit of work, those constraints turn out to give you higher order terms in the energy, which basically try to enforce those quadratic constraints that I told you about. so everything kind of works out fairly nicely. We can get closed form expressions as long as what we're interested in is almost flat structures. So I'll tell you right now, we're only going to look at the energetics of almost flat structures. Here's a typical example of a fourfold, the degree 4 vertex that we might be looking at. And the reason I'm putting this out here is that now that we have the possibility of having fold angles that have some energetic property to them, we can actually add auxiliary folds to the faces so that everything looks triangulated, and then just add an extra term in the energy that once these folds, torsional spring basically with an equilibrium angle that's set at 0 and has some stiffness that's set by the thickness of this particular face. Okay, so that's how we handle more complicated examples of structures that have quadrilateral and higher order faces. So this is what you get. When you do this, okay, you have this problem about what are you going to plot. If you plot the height of, say, the 4th vertex above the XY plane and the height of the 6th vertex above the XY plane, that makes sense as long as things aren't too folded. Then you can get a sequence of energy landscapes. And if you set the equilibrium angles the way that you want, then you can see that this set of energy contours has an actual minimum located essentially where you might want to put it. You can also see the structure, these lines emerging. This would have had 1 degree of freedom. So these would be purely, these are supposed to be purely curves in this space. But obviously when you're close to one of these branch points, it looks as if things are a little bit floppier than you might have expected if you were just looking at the constraints. So that makes sense because, they have 0 modes. That means something, right? So this is what we've actually been trying to look at and trying to understand basically what happens as you tweak the various equilibrium angles of the various folds, and how does this minimum move, say, from one branch to the other as you try to tweak these things. Okay, and so here's an example of that. This is the same structure I showed you before, where what we've done is we programmed fold angles to have this point as being the minimum. And then we slowly adjust the fold angles so that the minimum energy configuration would be walking along this line, okay? And what you see happen as you do this walk, that walk is represented by where the center of this white circle. As you walk along this, what you see is that instead of the minimum actually following you, it can't do that because that violates the constraints that cost too much energy. Instead, the minimum that you have starts walking back towards the flat state, and you nucleate a saddle point and a new minimum near the flat state. And as you keep on walking, that new minimum starts walking out along the branch, and the saddle point and the old minimum approach each other, and eventually they will annihilate, and you're left with a single minimum. And that obviously this is how it has to work, right? I mean, this I hope it shouldn't surprise anybody if you're stuck kind of living on these lines, but you're tweaking the equilibrium angles in a way that can't be satisfied by the constraints. This is the only thing it can do to get from this position to this position, right? But if you look more closely, what you realize is that, at least in this example, maybe it was a bad example now that I think about it, because the new minimum nucleated almost right away, but actually it turns out that you've got a little bit of a fudge factor. There's a little bit of a leeway. You can start adjusting things off of the initial branch without actually nucleating a new minimum, okay? And that comes from the finite flexibility of these structures. We can actually plot, for example, for various, we use the Foppel-von Karman number. This is just a measure of how thick the sheet is. For various Foppel-von Karman numbers, so for various sheet stiffnesses, you can plot where do you see what set of parameters along this line. Okay, we'll parameterize where we are on that line by some parameter, which I'll call A. And for what parameters do you see 1 minimum or 2 minima? And it turns out that the region where you see 2 minima, where you can actually get stuck in a metastable state, that width depends on not just how you program the fold angles, but also to what degree you program the fold angles. In other words, how far away from the flat state are you actually programming things? Oh, you can't see my fingers, right? So if you're all the way out here, then the bistability region, the region of bistability, is actually wider. If you're closer to the flat state, then you actually have a very narrow region where you have two minima that you have to worry about that are actually competing with each other. Okay, so we're now exploring this, trying to understand whether or not this actually makes any sense experimentally. We have some preliminary data, which I am obviously insisting you take with a grain of salt at this point, hence the picture. And don't pay any attention to the red and the blue dots right now. This is old data, and those dots are not useful for what we want to do. But if you look at the white and the two white dots, the circle and the square, you have what you can see is that at least for certain values, we really do have a narrow region of A, which is pretty consistent with what we've derived theoretically, where you have multiple minima. So what we're going to be doing, obviously, as we move forward, is adding more points to this and actually firming up that, to see how well things really agree. But at least the basic picture that you have a little bit of leeway in your branches before you develop new minima seems to hold pretty well. And so that sort of ends the first vignette. So stay tuned. But what I really wanted to get to is what we're doing with some of this knowledge, right? What we're doing with some of this information. But there may be some questions on this first vignette. I don't know. I heard a distinctive bing.
Actually, Chris, I did want to draw your attention way back in the chat. So Ian Tabasco pointed out a paper by Kapovich and Milson in 1997. Apparently, that allows. It sounds like you know about it.
Well, I know about them. I will double check the chat and make sure I know about their actual paper, because that would be embarrassing.
Yeah, Chris, if I could just say, in the meantime, I looked up your paper and you cited it.
Oh yeah, okay. So yes,
but
I know about
the issue
it.
is that the issue is they only deal with a single vertex.
Okay.
On the other hand, if you have a single vertex, they develop a beautiful connection via von Karman, although they don't say those words, to count these things.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I guess we did. I know. I knew it sounded familiar. I think we had actually. This is one of these situations where we thought we discovered some things that turns out that actually was in that paper already, which is, that's life. It's always been done by someone else before, right? Some mathematician somewhere.
Well, but only the single vertex case.
Yeah. Well, exactly. So thank you, though. That's all right. So one of the things that we have noticed in doing this is there isn't really a whole lot I told you. There's a lot of very specific origami things, but the basic setup actually it's just a matter of functions, right? We have this set of constraint functions, but these could be anything. And the whole analysis that we do, there's certain origami related elements, but the basic form of the analysis is just an analysis about singularities in systems of functions. And we could apply this to anything. And so this actually has motivated a collaboration with Lisa Manning on trying to see to what extent these things apply to, I guess, vertex models, which they use to model confluent cellular tissues. Confluent meaning that there's no gaps between the cells. And so that's kind of where we've been taking things. And I'll tell you a little bit about two different kinds of things that we've looked at. This slide also makes the point that really all we need to apply some of this apparatus is a set of generalized configurations and a set of generalized strains, and to which we can say there's some energy functional that's a sum of quadratic terms. And lots of things do this, right? So in typical vertex models for cells, I actually borrowed this slide from Lisa in case she watches this someday. For typical models of cells, you have terms that penalize perimeter of the cells and the area of the cells, and then you sum over all of them. It's really just a sum of squares, and we could perfectly well represent this with a constraint function of this form. Similarly, biopolymer networks involve spring constraints, typically in a typical theoretical setup, as well as torsional springs on them to simulate the bending energy of filaments, and all of these fit in the same formalism in principle, maybe with some distinctive features of writing energy functionals that are just squares of a set of terms that in principle we can try to understand that actually have a bit of a geometrical component. And what she was interested in particular was this observation that they had made about vertex models that live in 2 dimensions under periodic constraints. Okay, so here's an example. I false colored it because it looks like, I don't know, I want to think about spring. It's Easter colored, right? So here's what they noticed, right? So what they noticed is that when they don't stress the system, these things are under coordinated and they're floppy. In fact, there's lots and lots of 0 modes to this structure. But when they stretch these things out, they suddenly become rigid. What they actually do explicitly is you fix the box size and you decrease the equilibrium length of all of the individual elements of all the individual lines. In fact, this model that I'll tell you about first is a model of just fibers, just springs again. Okay, because that's obviously the simplest version of all of these models. This is a model of 2-dimensional springs that have this particular geometry. So they're all 3 coordinated, so on and so forth. So what they noticed is that when the equilibrium length is above a particular critical value, then there's lots and lots of 0 modes. If they measure the shear modulus is 0. But as soon as they decrease the equilibrium length to a particular value, which is equivalent essentially to stretching the periodic boundary conditions, they find that the system does in fact develop a shear modulus, and it actually increases linearly, it looks like, with the equilibrium length. Okay, and this is just for a model of just springs that satisfies this energy. Okay, but actually this behavior that they see is generic in all of the vertex models that they've looked at. When we look more closely, what you see is that above this critical length, the networks actually look something like this, and there's lots of 0 modes. If there's n vertices, there's n/2 0 modes, no self-stresses, and this is the state in which there's no shear modulus. But below the critical length, when the networks look something like this, then instead of having n/2 0 modes, you have an extra 0 mode is developed, and simultaneously you have an extra self-stress that develops. Okay, and that's the place where you have a shear modulus. So the question here is what's going on, and why is the system actually rigid when in fact it has so many floppy modes, so many 0 modes, and what does the self-stress have to do with anything? And immediately in thinking about this, you realize that much like the self-stress has played a role in understanding the singularity in the origami, that having the self-stress there means that you might have to worry about some of the higher order bits of the elasticity, some of the higher order bits of the rigidity. And the analogy, the analog model, which is very easy in principle to understand, that we have, is to imagine that you have a chain of elements. Okay, so this chain between 2 walls. Okay, so this chain has 4 0 modes and no self stresses. It's basically extremely floppy, but as soon as you pull it taut, then you develop a self stress and you get an extra 0 mode, because any one of these vertices can move up or down to linear order without changing the length. Okay, but we all know this thing is rigid, right? Because there's nothing you can do to any of these vertices that won't change the lengths. It's just that change is second order in the displacement, not first order. Okay, so the claim is that something similar is going on in these 2D systems. And in fact, you can show 2 things. One, you can show that you have to have a self-stress because the system itself is stressed, and that stress has to be self-stress. That's actually not saying very much, okay? But there's a bunch of math that backs it up, but it's basically, of course, it has a stress because you stressed it, right? But when we look at the quadratic part of the elasticity, you can actually show that the quadratic part gives you one of these quadratic constraints, and that this quadratic constraint is always positive definite. And that means that actually this 2D system is doing exactly the same thing that this really simple 1D system is doing, but it's doing it in a way that is a little bit harder to actually see. But in fact, even though there's 100 different ways, for example, of deforming this that costs you 0 energy to first order, it turns out there's no ways to do it that doesn't stretch some of the bonds to second order, okay? And when we actually apply this, we've managed to apply this also to more complicated systems. We actually started looking at vertex models where we just have a perimeter constraint, we drop the area constraint, and here something similar happens. Not only does it develop a shear modulus below a particular critical value, but it does so precisely because of these quadratic constraints, because of this quadratic part, this higher order part in the energy. Okay, so how am I doing on time, actually? Were there any questions? That's the sort of the second vignette. And again, we're still working on this. We're writing this up now and testing on it a bunch of different models. It turns out there's a few different cases that we have to think about, which once we start adding area constraints back in, the basic idea works, but then we have multiple self-stresses that we have to deal with. And the analysis is a little harder. But still, mostly it does seem like at the end of the day, for now, you'll see when the paper is written, it seems like it basically, the basic analysis still works there. All right, were there any questions about this part? The last part's really short, so I just want to make sure I didn't run out of time.
So if you're waiting for me to say what time it is, it's 2:56.
Okay, no, I have the time. I can't remember when we started at 2:05, right? So
Yeah.
I'm almost, yeah. Okay, so this part's really short. This is new work with a student, Michelle Berry, on the mechanical logic structures. And here the idea is to, again, take advantage of some of these singularities in order to create elements that actually that can actually, mechanical structures that actually do logic, right? We have various reasons that we use to sell this to funding agencies, why we'd want to do this, but honestly, it would just be cool, right, to have a material that actually does the work for you and makes decisions. And that's kind of what I have in my head as for what we're trying to do. And the principle here is that we can take advantage of having these kinds of bifurcations, like what happens in the origami, to actually do the logic for us. And the basic idea is, imagine you have some one-dimensional structure. Okay, so this is a structure with 1 degree of freedom. This one's easy. It looks complicated, but basically it just moves around in a circle. Okay, it's not that exciting. And we'll just take 2 of these. Okay, 2 of these that are initially independent of each other. Okay, so this is the one. It's just a single rod, and it moves on one circle. Here's another, more different device that moves on a different circle. And imagine that what we do is we measure the distance between these 2 vertices. Okay, and I actually did this for this precise system. In case you're curious, if you measure the distance between the 2 vertices as a function of the angle along which you are on the circle, basically the arc length along the circle, you get a surface. Okay, of course you do, right? It's just the distance between the vertices is the height of some surface, and the coordinates are just where you are along the 2 circles. Okay, and if you look at the surface, you can see that generically what's going to happen. You're going to have maxima, you're going to have minima of this height, you're going to have saddle points. Okay, and I've highlighted some of these. Here's a maximum, there's a minimum here. These 2 are saddle points, and it turns out that that those features, those topological features of this surface actually tells you something about the mechanics of these structures. In particular, if you were to put the structure at one of these saddle points, okay, you measure how far away these two things are, these two vertices are over here. I'll do the build again. When you're at one of these saddle points and you set that to be the equilibrium length of this bond, then you will automatically be in a position where you will automatically be at a singularity, at a place where you have a singularity. And depending on the index of this point, if it's a saddle or a maximum or a minimum, your system will either be second order rigid or it will have a branch structure. Okay, and so actually there's a very generic way of finding where these branches might occur. And we've been using this. So we use this to design a really beautiful, cool logic gate. And then it turns out again that somebody else beat us to it. But again, that's like how it is, right? That's how science is. So we've used that to start designing various kinds of logic gates. And in particular, here's one example that was actually invented by this guy, Ralph Merkle, where you have two 4-bar linkages, which here, this is 1 bar, 2 bar, and then you couple them together in a particular way. And by doing that, you took a system that has 2 degrees of freedom, you've added an extra constraint, and if you choose the length of this constraint right, you can design a structure that has a bifurcation in this state. And now either the top can move or the bottom can move, but not both. Okay, and so this is the energy landscape of this. These 2 red lines are the 0 energy configurations in this structure. Okay, and you can actually use devices like this essentially, and even more complicated devices to create gates. So an example of this, so there's the self-stress that appears, by the way, just to show that this is a singularity. And if I do this right, here's a movie of a signal propagating through this structure because the top part can move. But if we move the bottom part first and we play the same movie, the structure, it gets stuck. So this thing actually acts as a transistor and gives you a very generic framework to try to design mechanical elements that perform certain kind of logical operations. So we're working on this now, but that's where I want to end the talk. Also, we've run out of time. So what I hope that I've at least convinced you of with these 3 vignettes here is that these singularities are actually generic features of these mechanical systems. They lead to branch points like you have in origami, or to things that are rigid despite the existence of lots of self-stresses. And that we're starting to make progress on being able to control the singularities to actually do things that I hope somebody will find useful someday. So that's where I'm going to end the talk. Thank you for your attention. I haven't given too many of these Zoom talks yet, so usually I like to tell more jokes than this, but I think I told the jokes. I hope you laughed. I just don't know.
So thank you very much, Chris. That was excellent. That was outstanding. So our session's open for questions now. If you didn't get a chance to ask questions while Chris was going, or like if you're polite and stuff. Okay, so again, from a grad student, going back to the bird, when it folds wrong, do some of the mountain and valley folds flip over, become the mountain become valley and valley become mountain? Or is it just the folding order that's wrong? In other words, do you actually, shall I say, break the folding pattern?
So the order, so that particular bird design that I showed you actually has to all happen, all the folds have to happen simultaneously. We picked it that way on purpose. That's actually the generic case in origami. Typically origami, a typical piece of origami as designed by a computer and not designed by a person, all the folds happen simultaneously. However, so what actually, it's a little bit more of a complicated question to ask if some of the folds, mountains become valleys. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. In fact, some of the branches turn out to be associated with different choices of mountains and valleys. some of the branches are associated with different ways of orienting the vertices, whether we call it popping up or down relative to the XY plane. Some of the branches, they are just different angles, and I can't tell what the difference is. It's sort of, that's a more atypical case, but the more complicated your origami gets, the more often those kind of weird things where you have two different branches that are otherwise the same as far as your mountain valley fold assignment and what your vertices are doing, and they're just different angles and it just looks different. And yeah, it's kind of weird, right? But I guess and then the other question here, when it folds wrong, does it fold wrong the same way after you let it unfold? I wish I knew the answer to that question. The postdoc that did this with the birds actually is, he's now off somewhere. I don't think he checked. I feel it's like really frustrating, right? And so I don't know the answer. I know that the correct ones continue to fold correctly. And so there's nothing, it seems plausible that if it misfolds, it'll keep on misfolding the same way as well, because there's probably some plastic deformation happening, but I actually don't know.
Can I ask something about the first chapter of your talk, and actually about the very beginning of it, some almost a philosophical question. You started from saying that your origami is a set of constraints. And then I don't think you explicitly said so, but you said, oh, it's not a constraint, but just a spring with quadratic potential and some rest length and so on. So my question is whether this trick of replacing constraint with parabolic potential, is it just a matter of mathematical convenience or transferring difficult mathematical problem into more standard mathematics, or is it more because real origami are never really constraints, but really have some deformability, or how should I think about it?
I think the way you should think about it, so in the case of some of this, like with the using torsional springs, we have evidence that is in fact how our particular self-folding origami, the ones that I do with Ryan, work. They're really just elastomers in some sense. I mean, they're gels, but they essentially respond elastically. But more generally, philosophically, I think about this more as a mathematical convenience, and I've been very careful to focus a lot of what we've been doing to the place near the singularity. Because I think when you're near the singularity, you often have very universal features, and it didn't so much matter what model we used. You can see here that I used a model, for example, where the strain was the length minus an equilibrium length. Sometimes we do length squared minus the equilibrium length squared. It really depends on the context. And they always give the same results as long as you're near one of these singularities. And that's a math statement. That's a statement about, it's probably more sophisticated than just saying it's a statement about Taylor expansions. But in fact, that is a statement about the mathematics of functions that are sufficiently smooth. Now that I've said that, though, I can probably convince you that there must be some materials, possibly even paper itself, where the energetics of what's really happening is sufficiently complicated that it's not well represented by smooth functions, and I don't know what to do there. I think that would be interesting to look. For example, if you 3D printed this origami, you would have these joints that would, these pinions, and they would just shake, right? You'd have no energy cost for deforming it a little bit, and a very gigantic energy cost to, you break it to deform it more. And there, it may not be well represented this way. I don't actually know the answer, but it would certainly be interesting to look at. We have not thought about that at all. So I don't know if that totally answers your question,
It does to some extent, but
Yeah.
I have a continuation, if I may.
Sure.
Are there efforts to do it with a completely different mathematics, thinking about constraints and not going in? When you think about constraints, that means you live on some manifold. And when you relax your constraints, that means you go out of your manifold to the surrounding embedding Euclidean space.
Mm-hmm.
Can you still live on this presumably curved non-Euclidean manifold of constrained object and study it by some non-Euclidean geometry, like introducing some metric tensor there and so on?
Yes, I assume you can. And I think that's exactly what you need to do when you're not near one of these singularities. I would hesitate to do that near the singularity, in fact, for various reasons. I think that a lot of the physics is dominated by what happens in the states that are not quite satisfying the constraints, just because it's much softer there. But when you're farther away from the constraints, there's actually, I've been looking into this, there's a bunch of old chemistry work where they do this explicitly in the case of molecules, where I think they're the apparatus, they always avoided singularities when they do that, but they're the apparatus they developed in physical chemistry seems to be the right apparatus for thinking about the constraint manifolds farther away from the singularities. And they do take this kind of approach, non-Euclidean geometry approach. So people have done that. I don't think I've seen it. Maybe somebody else knows. I don't remember seeing it used in the origami case explicitly, but you know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I actually had a question about the sort of the second order rigidity in the face of zero modes that you showed us. So that kind of network, I mean, you described it as arising in the in foams, for example. So what that tells me, though, is that the mechanical stresses on the individual bubbles now are not what we thought they were, and in fact, the rigidity of the whole system is dominated by these second order effects. Does that change processes like coarsening?
Oh, geez, I don't know yet. I don't know. That's a good question. At some level, how could it not?
Right.
Yeah, but I don't know. We haven't looked at any. We've only looked at the rigidity of these things so far, and in fact, I can tell you this, that the part of the reason I focus so much on the the spring version of it is that one is easy to understand, and this other stuff with the foams, even though it looks like it's broadly similar, there are some differences, and that itself makes me hesitate to draw. I feel confident saying that, yeah, it's kind of the same thing because, you know, functions are functions, but there it's much harder to, how can I put it? It's much harder to establish we can establish connections between the second order elasticity and the rigidity, but there may be ways of wiggling out of that in that case and bringing back some floppiness. And there's several cases. There's cases where it can happen and cases where it can't happen. And we have not completely yet classified all of those cases. The specific example I gave you seems to be in a case that can't wiggle out of it, but there are definitely other cases that can, and there's some cases that we can't find any examples of. Does that mean they never happen? I don't know. And that has to do with the fact that there are ways of deforming things that might lower the energy, but are not at all along, don't preserve the lengths anyway, or don't preserve the constraints. I mean, you could lower the energy just by making one of the cells fatter and then the surrounding cells smaller. If that happens, then none of this stuff, you know, that's a different mechanism entirely. And I wonder if that's more relevant to things like the coarsening question that you asked, in which case the real answer is I have no idea.
Thank you. Do other people have questions? Either unmute yourself and ask or hit us up in the chat. And if the questions are winding down, I'll invite people to thank Chris one more time. we'll stop the recording, but that doesn't mean you have to leave. It just means we're going off the recorded record to ask questions and talk about things that we don't necessarily want to record for posterity. So for everyone who came out, thank you very much. It was great to see you.
Yeah, thank you for coming.